Hello and welcome back to Warrior Radio. My name is Tony Baldwin, and in today's episode I sit down with Dave Siever of Mind Alive. And to me, he's the Yoda of brainwave entrainment. He really is one of the most knowledgeable people that I've met in this industry. He's been in it for over 30 years. He came out with one of the first audio and visual entrainment products in the industry, and also Cranio-Electro Stimulation products as well. Like I was saying, he's one of the most knowledgeable authorities on things like brainwave entrainment, things like neurofeedback, things like mind stimulating technology. And he just has a library of knowledge that he can, reference at the drop of a hat, with things like all the case studies that's been put out on brainwave entrainment, all the different scientific studies and all the scientific literature that's out there throughout the last few decades on this method. And in this interview, you'll learn, the latest science on using brainwave entrainment to improve things like memory, things like focus and mood, and just overall well-being. And this episode especially hits home for me because about a year ago I was struck with a really, really bad surf concussion while I was living in Bali. And it really just took me out of my regular life. I couldn't work. I couldn't really socialize a whole lot. And I was really just resting for a good 5 or 6 months. And it was one of the most trying periods of my life. Emotionally, it was one of the most challenging. I had noise and light sensitivity. I couldn't work. And it was just a really, really tough situation. And if you've had a brain injury, you know what I'm talking about, because it really is, from what most people say, it's one of the most difficult times of their life. And what's interesting with this interview is Dave has done a lot of work in the field of concussions and traumatic brain injuries, and how entrainment can be used to solve these health issues and solve these injuries. So a good chunk of the interview is dedicated to sort of the science of concussions, the neuroscience of it, and how brainwave entrainment could be used to solve these issues. So it especially hit home for me, and I hope that you enjoy this interview as much as I did recording it. And if you do like this interview, be sure to rate us and subscribe to the podcast, because you'll be updated with all the new episodes in the future, and all the new warrior goodness shall be given to you with the update. So with that said, I want to present to you with Dave Siever. Just for those who don't know, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, and just the story behind Mind Alive?
I'm Dave Siever, owner of Mind Alive, and I got into this in a very roundabout, unexpected way. I'm trained as an electronics engineer, and one day way back in the early '80s, actually, I landed a job at the university developing a research lab for TMJ dysfunction. TMJ is temporomandibular joint. So that's the jaw joint where our mandible, our lower jaw meets our upper set of teeth. And often people with stress or dental issues develop a lot of muscle pain and tension in there, and they get usually headaches and tinnitus and other things associated with it. So I built a research lab to make the world's best splints. The splints was horseshoe-shaped plastic things that you can put in the mouth. And I developed all kinds of really cool things in the research lab to treat this. But what I realized, now this is in the 80s, and what I'd realized after a couple of years in is that the dentists were not taking a very good approach to this. They were always assuming everything had something to do with the bite or the occlusion, and they never addressed the psychological side to TMJ dysfunction, whereas psychologists completely address the psychological side, and that's just about as wrong too, because usually it's a blend of both dental issues and psychological issues. Anyway, I started having all of our patients fill out a life event scale and an intake form, which the dentists typically didn't really do, and discovered that almost all of them were women, 25 to 35 years of age with one or two toddlers, and most of them had husbands working in the oil industry. And that was interesting because Alberta here is a huge oil producer. Now we have, I think we were estimated to have the third biggest oil reserves in the world, but our oil is trapped in the oil sands. And maybe you've heard of the oil sands or the tar sands. It's been on the news a bit. And the problem with the tar sands is that the oil here isn't just easy, stick a well down and pump it out. They have to strip mine all the sand and extract the oil. So it's expensive. So it costs us quite a bit more to pull the oil out than it does for Saudi Arabia, let's say, for example. So anyway, oil had dropped to under $15 a barrel for a period of time in the 80s. And these are all the wives of oil workers who were all worried about layoffs and wage rollbacks and things like this, or reduced hours at work. And a lot of them, of course, had, big mortgages, fairly new marriages still. And the two things that showed up the most on the life event questionnaire was increase in arguments with spouse and financial worries, usually 3 to 6 months prior to having all this jaw pain. So that was kind of interesting. And part of the deal, too, when I was building the research lab is to test all our EMG gear and a bunch of other things that we had made. I'd have to wire my face up and all my muscles up on my head. And sometimes I'd have, 10 or 12 wires all hanging from me. And then it'd be lunchtime. So we would just take all the wires, put them into a braid, go down for lunch. And we got a bit of a reputation as being mad scientists. And roughly in 1984, in fact, it was the fall of 1984, an instructor in performing arts had heard that there were a couple of crazy mad scientist guys happening. And so he sent me an email. I don't know if emails existed then, but he certainly sent me a letter asking me if I could build this crazy light and sound flashing light machine with pulsing tones.
Yeah.
That he wanted to use it on his students with stage fright, so that he could treat stage fright. And he had heard that he could put them in hypnotic trances and things like this. I had not heard of this before, and I thought really it was quite a ridiculous new age kind of scam or something that was going on out there. But I decided to give it a shot. He was willing to pay me. I needed the money. I was dealing with big mortgage too and everything else. So in the fall of 1984, I started designing the machine for him. And somewhere in the winter of 85, I started using it on myself, and I had that thing half built and discovered that, whoa, this thing was really, what it did to my head was incredible. I'd never experienced just dropping into trance states like that before in my life. And so I was pretty intrigued with it. Anyway, I got his machine to him finally in June or July of 85 and built two of them, built one for me and one for him. And I started using it on myself to get myself through my own stress. Then I thought, what would have happened if I started using it on all our patients with jaw pain and this TMJ dysfunction? So I started putting it on our patients, and we had remarkable results at relaxing their jaw. It was so remarkable. There was nothing that I have ever seen in my life, not biofeedback, not anything that can relax jaw as fast as audio-visual entrainment. So then in 1988, we published a study on it. We took our 10 worst patients who had severe chronic pain for 10 years or more. And within 10 minutes, they were all pain-free, and then, of course, in a deep trance, but pain-free, which often held up for a couple of days. So I realized we had something here that was not just a placebo or a new age fad, but there was something real about this. And so then I started spending a lot of hours at the Health Sciences Library looking for research, and discovered the whole idea of driving brainwaves was discovered in 1984. And a whole bunch of little studies. There had been thousands of physiological studies done where you flash lights and you look at the EEG or cerebral blood flow or something like this. But there weren't very many psychological studies looking at how did a person feel when they were on audio-visual entrainment. But there were enough to show that there was validity to it. I was concerned that it would die a new age fad. And as you know, there's been, I think since I've been involved, at least 40 or 50 companies have come and gone because of the fact that they didn't support research. And anyway, we started then doing our own studies. I was hiring students from the university in the psychology program. We were talking up at other universities, especially the U of T in Austin, have done half a dozen studies on our gear. They did a big one on worry in college students and found that entrainment was more effective for treating worry than the other techniques that they typically use. And because it's so easy to run entrainment, they also had a very low dropout rate, which is another important thing. So anyway, so far we have been involved in 24 studies on entrainment. The last one I think that we have done, but we have a couple in the works right now on PTSD, and one on problem-solving ability under stress. And they're going to show that entrainment, indeed, people can solve problems faster and better if they're on entrainment when they stress them. But meanwhile, the latest one was done in California by a grad student at Saybrook University, and found that basically in this group she had that were 68 years of age on average, and she looked at memory, and she also did EEG and looked at brainwave frequency. Well, brainwaves really slow down with age after 65, and that's a sign of cognitive decline and maybe eventual dementia. So what she found is that not only did entrainment double their memory, but it sped up their brainwaves such that this group that were, say, average age of 68 years of age, and at the end of 1 month, they had the brain equivalent of a 50-year-old.
Wow.
So that's been our latest study. Yeah, it really does rejuvenate the brain well. So there you go. In a nutshell, that's kind of my story. I should mention a little bit, too. I got into electrostimulation because I was making TENS stimulators. That was my first project way back in 81. And so we continue to do Cranio-Electro Stimulation and transcranial DC stimulation and those type of technologies as well.
So there's a lot of different things that we covered that I'd like to just sort of individually slice over the next over this interview. But just to get set a foundation for those that don't know sort of how audio and visual brainwave entrainment works, could you just briefly explain just sort of the science behind that?
Yeah, entrainment is misleading to some degree. The concept of entrainment is that if you drive brainwaves, or basically, entrainment means if you have if there's something out there, a stimulus or stimuli, a repeating stimulus out in the world, and a biological organism is receiving this stimulus, that part of their body will start to resonate with it. In the case of audiovisual entrainment, of course, we're expecting the brainwaves to resonate with the frequency of stimulation. And there have been a lot of studies done since, Adrian and Matthews in 1934. A lot of them, though, were using square waves, which are like a strobe light, which turns on instantly and turns off instantly. And that has quite a prominent driving effect on frequency. But there are other aspects to entrainment that are even more important. For instance, the waveforms we use are typically sine waves, or what we call a modified sine wave. It's a bit of an aggressive sine wave, but we don't use square waves. Square waves often can trigger a third harmonic, which can cause an anxiety or a panic attack, or they can also increase risk of having a seizure, which is typically pretty rare anyway. But with the stuff we use, it's non-existent. We've not seen one at all. So anyway, the concept, the whole idea of entrainment is that the frequencies of the brain will start to match the frequency of stimuli. But that's really an insignificant part of the story. Entrainment also increases nitric oxide in cerebral blood flow. It also causes the brain to switch from aerobic to anaerobic burning of glucose through adenosine triphosphate. It also causes dissociation, like people drift off into deep trances on it if it's done correctly. It also increases neurotransmitters such as serotonin, norepinephrine, and endorphins. And it also causes autonomic calming. You can very, very quickly calm a person down with entrainment. We've got heart studies, all kinds of biofeedback studies to show this. So it does a bunch of different things. It also just really stimulates the brain and can really get the brain rolling again just from pure stimulation. And so we did an experiment because there's a lot of people selling audiovisual stimulation products out there. So we did a little experiment to differentiate the difference between entrainment and all these effects versus stimulation. So we randomized the entrainment at up to plus minus 1 hertz. So if we were giving someone alpha at 10, let's say, we would also every 4 or 5 seconds randomize it to, maybe to up plus minus 1 hertz. So maybe for 10 seconds, we would give them, 10.3. And then maybe we give them 9.5 and then 10.7 and 9.2. And we would randomize it this way. And we actually found that it worked better when it was randomized, some up to plus minus 1 hertz, probably because we were dissociating people better. And when people dissociate better, the effects seem to work a lot better. Then we tried plus minus 2. And plus minus 2 didn't work very well at all. Then we tried plus minus 3, and it didn't work at all. Certainly at plus minus 3, we were giving them audio-visual stimulation, but not audio-visual entrainment. So they were getting nothing better than watching TV or sitting on the roadside and watching the traffic go by. So that has to be controlled, and I can tell you out there in the real world, it's not. And most people use, I think maybe pretty much everyone still uses square waves, and they've turned out to be a rather problematic waveform for stimulating. But things that are coming out of entrainment, because we have a brain mapper in our office, and so I brain map a lot of people in our office. And this last year, it's kind of funny because the U.S. Military have been buying about 40 units a month from us for the last few years for their war vets. And not only are they treating the post-traumatic stress disorder, but also a lot of these guys have cognitive problems because they've got concussive injuries from explosions and things like this, shock waves relating to explosions from bombs and things like this, or just hits on the head. And they're saying it was resolving both. But the weird thing is typically when someone has PTSD, you would expect to give them alpha to treat them. But they were giving them alpha beta or SMR beta. Now, alpha beta, we have a patent on a technique where we can put one set of stimuli on the left side, left fields of the eyes and left headphone, and a different frequency on the right-hand side of right fields of the eyes and the right headphone. And that makes for, you can kind of stimulate two frequencies in the brain simultaneously. But the other thing it does is it makes very complex neural activity in the brain on the neuronal level is going on because it's just getting pounded with all the stimuli, with all these different latencies between the two frequencies and stuff like this. And that in itself has some pretty remarkable effects. Now, the alpha beta, we were using that to treat depression, and it works extremely well for depression. But the SMR beta, now SMR means sensory motor rhythm, and it's typically in the 12 to 15 cycles per second category, whereas beta is usually up around 20. So a number of these, while the military was having all these remarkable results with their vets, I too am getting clients with concussions and things like this, and I'm brain mapping them. And I started putting them on the SMR beta, and if they seem to have some depression, I put them on the alpha beta. But the SMR beta is one that is most compelling because here I'm giving them SMR beta and they're generating alpha. Now, the thing about concussion is that I'm going to back up a little bit here. I was at a concussion conference this spring put on, and I couldn't believe my ears. They had a panel of so-called concussion experts. They had an ER doctor from the U of A, University of Alberta Hospital. They had a psychology professor from the U of A, and they had another fellow who was a medical doctor who claimed to be a sport concussion specialist. They all said that you can't detect these concussion injuries and there's no treatment. And I'm like, holy smokes, you guys, come on. I said, have you guys never used EEGs? Look at brainwaves? Never. They just look at MRIs. Well, you're not going to see anything on an MRI when someone is functionally knocked out. You need to look at the EEG, and it's a lot cheaper than an MRI too. So basically, when people have concussion, now these are called diffuse axonal concussions, which are the most common type. And what they are is between the neurons on the skin of our brain, which is the cortex up at near the skull, and the thalamus, which is a couple inches down, they have a loop themselves. And basically, when we're engaged on a task, like I am right now speaking to you, you will find that my brain waves will be fairly dominant well, I wouldn't say they'll be fairly dominant in beta, but there'll be very little alpha in my brain. And probably the beta and the alpha ratio are about 50-50. But as soon as I close my eyes and relax, especially if I try to meditate, now my brain doesn't really have anything to process. So the neurons, instead of talking to each other, start shooting a little link down to the thalamus. And they say, hey, how are you doing down there? And the thalamus goes, well, I'm good. How about you? Well, I'm fine. How about you? Well, I'm still fine. How about you? And this little link goes over and over and over and over. It takes 100 milliseconds for this little loop to carry out, which happens to be 10 cycles per second, and it's alpha. So when people have diffuse axonal concussions, they've lost that connection between the cortex and the thalamus, and therefore they don't make an alpha wave. And if you don't make an alpha wave, you can't sleep. The other thing is they got billions of neurons that are offline, and as a result of that, they really struggle with cognitive problems, and they really struggle with emotional control. And that was another thing that came up at the concussion conference. A question from the audience asked the psychology professor, if someone had a pre-existing condition, would they treat that condition before they treated the concussion? And he falsely said yes. And I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, most conditions are a result of concussion, or what I would call diffuse axonal interruptions. And the thing is, you don't even need to have a head injury to cause this. Fevers can cause it. So you could have a nasty, have mono or a chicken pox or some kind of a nasty viral infection that gives you, serious fever for a while, and it can knock billions of neurons offline. Now, you may have heard the saying, which is becoming pretty popular these days, but the saying is the neurons that fire together wire together. But the other side to that saying is that the neurons that fire apart link apart, or the neurons that fire out of sync lose their link. And so during a fever or a head injury or inflammation of the brain, these neurons appear to get somehow, either they're firing out of sync or they get taken offline intentionally by the brain as it's healing itself. There's a period after a fever or a traumatic event to the head. It's called diaschesis, and it's a 6-week period of inflammation and typically also a fevered brain where it's healing itself. And probably in that process, billions of neurons get taken offline. And because they're now firing apart or they're firing out of sync, so they lose their link, after basically the brain has kind of healed, the neurons are still not engaged because the brain doesn't recognize them anymore. And so billions of neurons are offline, and we do an EEG. Yeah, we see that there's no alpha waves. But another thing about neurons is, guess what neurons love to do? They love to send out impulses. They love to shoot out, electrical pulses from their axons or their tails. That's what they like to do. That's what neurons do. So one of the things I puzzled over for a long time was how come when I look at delta phase, so the brain makes delta waves continuously as well, usually in small proportions, and they grow and they get much larger, of course, as we fall asleep. But there's also a delta wave pattern that is a bit of a sign of pathology. And again, if the pacemaker, the thalamus of the brain, is taken offline, between that and the neurons, the neurons then don't have a sync pulse anymore from the thalamus, so they just go, well, heck, they like to fire, so they start firing off all on their own randomly, and as a result of firing off randomly, there's no synchronization. The conductor is gone. So when you look at delta phase, it's a real mess. And I puzzled over this for years, well, maybe a few years anyway, as to why this delta phase thing was happening, because there's also a brainwave signature that is low alpha, high beta, tied to anxiety. But it's not quite the same as a concussive injury that looks primarily the same, except for this delta phase problem, and there's also a beta phase problem, which I'll get into in a minute. But so anyway, I managed to came across a study by Robert Thatcher, where they had basically taken rat neurons and they put them in a Petri dish, And then they did electrical recordings off these neurons, and they found that indeed they just fire randomly in delta if they don't have a synchronization pulse from another part of the brain. So that's what put it all together and made sense. I was seeing this, and I tell you, nobody has spotted this before. So I really then carefully monitored all my patients, or my clients, I mean, who had who showed head injuries, and I've written a 50-page report on it, which I'd be happy to send you that copy, because we'll be publishing this in the medical journal fairly soon. And but anyway, so not only did we discover the signature of concussion, which so many people are interested in, and so many people are misdiagnosed completely. And so I document 3 cases in my paper: an anorexic, a binge alcoholic, and a lady who's kind of OCD-ish and really sensitive to body things still 5 years post car accident. And the alcoholic, he was really interesting. Now, the anorexic seems to have developed her diffuse axonal interruption, I'll call it, as a result of a fever when she was younger. And as a result, she developed anorexia from that. Again, when you lose cognitive control, when you lose your cognitive ability and you lose your emotional control, hundreds of things can happen behaviorally. And so that's why I documented 3 very different cases. In the case of the binge alcoholic, I mean, he came in to get a brain map because he was an alcoholic. And I'm looking at his brain map, and I went, whoa. I said, you've got a serious head injury, one of the worst I've seen. And he goes, oh, yeah, I forgot to tell you, when I was like 6 years old, I fell off the monkey bars and crushed my head in an inch.
Wow.
And I said, yeah, it was a serious head injury. And I said, well, holy smokes. And well, no wonder he was a binge alcoholic. I mean, socially requires, I mean, all cognitive tasks require that the brain perform to some degree, but social is really demanding on the brain. We have 3,000 facial expressions that are fleeting. They're changing second by second. So when you're out on an evening, you're with all your friends and you're hanging out with your friends and family or whatever, you're reading all those facial expressions, verbal intonations, body language changes, and your brain is processing thousands of events a second. And maybe not thousands, but certainly hundreds of events a second. And you got to be kind of on the ball mentally to really engage socially. And when people have these interruptions, one of the first things they lose is their social ability. And so they kind of become reclusive. They kind of hang out on their own. Whenever they're with a group of people, they always feel like they're on the outside. They can't feel like they're part of the group. That's because they can't connect. And then they often start drinking and developing, because they don't make alpha waves and they're typically anxious and they can't sleep. So they start developing what I call holic habits, whether it's drinking or smoking pot or eating junk food, which drives up dopamine and helps them relax. They develop these weird behaviors as they try to cope with things. And often they develop strange behaviors just for the sake of control, because they really don't have much control in their lives because they're just not really there cognitively. And if they're knocked out emotionally, they'll feel like they don't have control, even if they do. So they develop all these strange spin-off behaviors. And so I couldn't believe it when that professor said that he would treat a pre-existing condition first, when most of these conditions are a result of the concussion.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So what's the protocol with audio-visual entrainment when you're trying to solve something like concussion? Can you just talk us through what are the sort of mechanics behind sort of solving it with AVE?
Yeah, the surprising thing is that I started recording them on entrainment, full hour long recordings, and instead of just doing my sort of diagnostic recording, I was recording them on the fly. And now, of course, the military had discovered this several years ago, and were telling me about using the SMR beta frequencies, which are in our brain brightening protocol group. So you just have to go to the light bulb on our machine and pick one of those protocols, and away you go. And then kind of pick the one that you think might be best for you. But the military never ran EEG, so they didn't know the mechanism of action that was going down or playing out. And whereas because I have a full mapper and a normative database, I could see it happening in real time. But you just basically, now if a person seems to have a lot of negative emotions, I'll put them on the alpha beta, which is the happy face protocol. that we typically use for depression. But what's interesting is these people don't make alpha waves, as I mentioned, and the SMR beta is really what's interesting, because everybody thinks entrainment is about driving the frequency of stimulation, but in this case, it's not at all, because I'm giving them SMR and beta, and typically it takes about 15 minutes, and I'll watch, they have really choppy, agitated-looking EEG, and about 15 minutes in, suddenly an alpha spindle pops off, and then another, and then another, and then another, and suddenly they start streaming alpha. Well, the other thing that happens on entrainment is that these people, of course, are tired, and entrainment typically puts people to sleep quite effectively. So even though they're in my office, they got all this big cap on their head, and they got headphones and lights going, and they got this old bald guy staring at them, they fall deep into sleep, and their head falls over to the side. Sometimes they're snoring, and that's very common when I have people in our brain room and I'm giving them stimulation. Meanwhile, though, as they're falling asleep, they start cranking off big delta wavelets, which are large because they're in such deep sleep. But they're also still making alpha. So you'll see a big delta wave, then an alpha, what we call an alpha spindle, which is a whole group of little alpha wavelets for usually a second or two. Then they make some delta, then more alpha, then more delta, then more alpha. And when the session's over, I'll continue to brain map them until they wake up, which is usually about 30 minutes. And when they wake up, they go, wow, am I ever rested? Wow. And holy smokes, I'm not foggy-headed. The fog is lifted. And they get all excited. Well, to add to this, I have everybody fill out a psychometric index called an SCL-90, a symptom checklist 90. And it measures all kinds of things about how they feel about themselves. Well, the norm is 50, and if you score a 60, you're considered to have clinical problems. And, of course, these guys are usually scoring 100. Well, post-session, they're usually down to 30, which is better than normal population. And in 3 weeks, they're typically down to 10, which means they're really doing well emotionally and cognitively. And they get their whole lives back together. They get back to work. They quit drinking. Their anorexia just completely is gone, usually in about a 3-week span. So this has been a dramatic surprise for us. And part of the reason why it's a dramatic surprise and it took so long is because it's counterintuitive. Because everybody had their head so stuck on the entrainment model being that frequency of brain waves would mimic the frequency that you're driving. And so when I saw all these people, of course, with no alpha, I was giving them alpha, and it wasn't very successful, probably because alpha stimulation just doesn't have enough energy to bootstart the brain. So whereas SMR beta and alpha beta blends are like putting paddles on the brain and giving it a shot, and suddenly the brain goes, whoa, we've got neurons here we didn't realize for the last 20 years. And dendrites can grow pretty fast. Typically, dendrites can grow in 10 minutes when you're learning a new task, like learning to play a song on the piano or just anything new. Someone's phone number. We can grow dendrites usually in about 10 minutes, and that might be part of the reason why they have to entrain for full 15 minutes usually before I suddenly see the neurons kick in and these alpha spindles start to fly off their brains. It's probably because it takes, about a 15-minute span for the dendrites and stuff to reconnect to all these neurons that have been sitting dormant for years and years. So there you go. There's sort of my concussion thing. But this could be huge. And car accidents. Like this girl was in litigation, the one with the 5 years post-car accident. They were suing the person who hit her. And the law firm had been bugging her for almost a year to write a victim impact statement. And she hadn't got a title down yet because she just couldn't organize her thoughts and focus. Well, 3 weeks later, she sent me a 15-page report. And it was really well written. Wow. So it just goes to show what's going on. But see, it was counterintuitive using two different frequencies to get alpha. No one expected that, and I didn't expect it. But it's really profound so far, and then we really need to engage people to get out there and start doing more studies on this because I've done the research myself. People are going to say, well, it's suspect. Although, I mean, brain waves aren't that suspect. I can't really alter people's brain waves. But nonetheless, we need third-party people doing the research, and we really need to get this into football players and such.
Yeah. And I've heard a lot of like AVE enthusiasts talking about sort of the SMR. They usually try to do that regularly, maybe once a day or a few times a week. They make it a point to do that specific protocol. Can you, for those that don't know, you touched on it a little bit, but can you get a little bit further, deeper into what SMR is and sort of the benefits just for everyday people to sort of use that entrainment protocol?
Yeah. Now, SMR in itself is it's a kind of a poorly used term, and I'm using it really in a poor offhanded way myself.
Yep.
But alpha is the main idling rhythm for the main brain, and whereas SMR, or sensory motor rhythm, is the main idling rhythm for the sensory motor strip. And the sensory motor strip lies between your ears. If you went up from the left ear, if you drew a line between the left ear and the right ear and you got center, well, right from center all the way down about good 2 to 3 inches down until you hit the temporal lobe, that's your sensory motor strip. And it idles at typically around 13, 14 cycles per second, not at 10, which is alpha for the rest of the brain. Now, the thing about ADHD, for instance, ADHD kids, their frontal lobes are in theta. They're really shut down, their frontal lobes. And the frontal lobes, of course, play a big role in inhibition of responses, particularly emotional responses. And, of course, that's partly why our concussive people have issues, because their frontal lobes are shut down. But with ADHD, they're shut down. They make a lot of theta in their brain waves. And because the frontal lobes inhibit the motor strip, when the frontal lobes are shut down, the brake guy is he's sleeping. The guy on the brakes, he's sleeping. And so the motor strip runs wild. And that's why ADHD kids are hyperactive and impulsive, is because there's no regulation on the motor strip. And there's no SMR showing either. There's no sensory motor rhythm showing because, of course, they're hyperactive. When you give an ADHD child Ritalin and it wakes up the frontal lobes, the brake guy, that's how I basically explain it, the brake guy suddenly goes, whoa, I'm awake. And he hits the brakes, and the children completely calm down, and SMR goes way up. And so for neurofeedback, SMR up training has been a popular thing. But also studies have shown that if a person is quite edgy, a lot of anxiety, that kind of a thing, and they can't sleep well, SMR up training really helps calm down a racy head. And I don't think and that was really counterintuitive too, when those first studies were done on neurofeedback. They thought that theta was going to calm down the brain a whole lot better with racy-headed people. But it turns out that SMR worked better. And they thought there must have been something wrong in their research. So they did a second study to see what would happen. And it actually validated their first study. So it turns out they did do it correctly. Now, we don't always know exactly why SMR is so important. But say when you do bring up SMR, especially in the motor strip, it has a real calming effect physically on us. Really calms us down. But also, we think it's probably activating hubs in the brain, these network hubs, and just because it carries more energy. But I find, too, that the more anxious a person is, the faster I have to run them. In days past, everybody said, well, if you've got anxiety, run alpha or run Schumann resonance, which is a little slowed alpha at 7.8 hertz. But I'm finding most of the time now with most of my clients, if it's just, if you're just a normal person with having a bad day, alpha's great. But a lot of people who have chronic anxiety, alpha doesn't even work for them at all. We have to run them faster. We have to run them on alpha beta blends or SMR beta blends or SMR. And that knocks them clean out. And so that too is counterintuitive. It's contrary to what the literature suggests would work best for somebody with anxiety. That being said, however, I can tell you after 20 years of brain mapping, I have determined that there are at least four types of anxiety. There's slow brain, there's two types of fast brain, and there's depression-based anxiety as well. And technically, they all should be treated differently. But it's amazing how faster frequencies resolve a lot of these issues. That being said, though, in the past, we never made the connection with these diffuse axonal interruptions in the brain and having anxiety. we just assumed it was an anxiety pattern and not necessarily a concussive type of pattern. So all this prior research really needs to be revisited and reevaluated, because we probably interpreted a lot of it wrong for the last 20 or 30 years. So that'll be hopefully the next step. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of what we talked about is sort of solving health issues, almost people that aren't in negative and want to get to a neutral. But for people that are relatively healthy, their brains work just fine, and they almost want to get from a neutral to a positive and sort of take their brain to the next level, sort of improve memory and things like that. Like, can you get into a little bit of sort of the details of how people can use AVE to sort of improve their sort of functional brain?
Yes, in fact, on our website, I have a paper there that I published a few years ago showing that this works incredibly well, not just for seniors, but for college students. And studies have shown that, again, an SMR beta blends not only improve memory, but they improve concentration tremendously just in an hour. But they really improve memory. There was a study done on 78 college students out of Germany, and they found that during memory tests, so basically they did a memory test, see how they responded, and then one group would get entrainment, and the other group would get a placebo. Usually it was listening to a CD playing with relaxing music. And then they would go back and do the memory test. Well, the ones in the control group actually did worse the second time because their brains were still tired from the first memory test. Whereas the entrainment people just pounded them on memory. Their memory shot up so much in the hour from using entrainment. And Budzinski did a study showing that students who used entrainment had 1 GPA improvement over the control group, which is pretty astounding. And then there's the worry studies. Again, so anyway, if a person has a lot of anxiety, there's an optimal functional frequency in the brain where we really perform best. And on an eyes closed, that's usually alpha in around 10.2 to 10.5 cycles per second is really optimal for us. If we get faster than that, we are certainly sharper in terms of observing events around us, but we get overcome with anxiety. So there's a lot of students out there who are running fast brainwaves, or a lot of people in general. And when you look at their brainwave, eyes closed, they're making 11 or 12 or even 13 cycles per second. Their alpha is very fast because their brain is wound out on adrenaline, which is called norepinephrine when it's in the brain. And they're extremely observant. The thing is, they get exhausted so quickly, and they often have anxiety disorders, and they just can't handle tasks that are demanding. They fall to pieces. And then you've got the people whose brainwaves are slower, and not only do they process and intake stuff more slowly in terms of what they observe around them, but they just don't process stuff very well cognitively. They don't process stuff emotionally well. Their brake guy in their brain is kind of sleeping, so they have all kinds of anxiety from no brakes. So you've got too much gas anxiety. You've got also a no brakes anxiety. And so entrainment you can use really for either group. You can certainly, if someone is running slow, we can speed them up, and we've seen that over and over again. And if someone is running fast, we can slow them down. Now, in the case of this concussive stuff that we're seeing, and I know in the past I've had dozens and dozens of clients who had that signature, but we didn't recognize it. Well, now we've got a whole new thing where we're going to give them probably SMR beta or alpha beta as a way of generating their alpha and calming them down. So this will be the third type of scenario where we can use entrainment to really, really modulate or balance their arousal so they function optimally.
Wow. And a lot of people, like audio entrainment is very popular online, especially binaural beats, and but not many people have tried visual entrainment. And why is visual entrainment so much more effective when you add sort of the visual and the audio together?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things. First of all, I've got an article on our website regarding binaural beats, and all the research on binaural beats show they don't actually work. They don't entrain the brain whatsoever. They don't impact. See, to entrain the brain, you must stimulate the thalamus. The thalamus is the gateway keeper to all of our senses except for smell. And so whether you're tapping someone's fingers or whether it's flashing lights or pulsing tones, it all routes into the thalamus. And then the thalamus is innervated to the entire cortex, and it's a cortical thalamic loop that makes our alpha waves. But when you do binaural beats, they don't stimulate the thalamus at all because they're two pure tones. And in years past, when people were doing, the players that got involved in binaural beats originally didn't understand neurophysiology at all. And so they had rooms set up with loudspeakers in the rooms, and they would be playing the two different frequencies for binaural beats. But what they didn't realize is that the beats would blend in the room. And just like tuning a guitar or tuning, an instrument, the beat is actually hitting the eardrum. Now, when the beat impacts the eardrum, now it will indeed, because it's a real beat energetically in terms of sound waves. Well, now that will also affect the thalamus, and those are actually monaural beats. They're not binaural beats. And they mistakenly thought they were binaural beats for the longest time. And then when they were doing headphone uses, which is the only way you can actually get a true binaural beat is through headphones. So you keep the two tones separated. But what they were doing is they were playing two different tones, but they had them panned on their mixing boards. They had them panned in the middle. Well, as soon as you pan them in the middle, now they blend through the mixing board, and you still get monaural beats. But when people tried true binaural beats, they could not see any brainwave effects, except that I find that binaural beats do have a tendency to be calming, just like anything that is just a monotonous tone, like white noise or anything has a calming effect. And so binaural beats will have a calming effect just by playing them because they're two monotone kind of tones with this little kind of rhythm going on, and it just kind of makes us more relaxed. So it has a dissociative aspect to it, but binaural beats do not drive brainwaves, and EEG studies cannot find a brainwave ever driven from a binaural beat. So unfortunately, it's really being misrepresented, binaural beats pretty much completely. Now, when you get into audio-visual, and again, when you get into the visual, to have these effects that I'm talking about, you need to get away from square wave stimulation. And very few people get away from square wave stimulation. We're one of the few people who don't use square waves because of all the problems that they cause. Visuals do have quite an impact on the brain in terms of, say, cerebral blood flow, driving brain waves, neurotransmitters, all that stuff, autonomic calming. But there are more and more studies emerging with audio techniques for autism, like auditory training, tomatis training, where they can jumpstart circuits in the brain just using audio stimulation, not on an entrainment basis at all, just pure stimulation. Like, for instance, where they can take Beethoven and they can crank up the treble so it's really tinny sounding. And when they do that, the audio energy that impacts into the audio circuits of the brain and the auditory cortex seem to jumpstart all kinds of neural networks there. And they've had some highly successful results just by playing tinny sounding Beethoven or Mozart into the brain to excite these neurons. And they've treated autism and behavior disorders, ADD, and so on. So we're not looking at just trying to entrain, but we're looking at actually trying to stimulate these neurons, like putting paddles on the neurons, like I say, and getting these neurons to fire together so they wire together. And audio does that. Now, when we're doing auditory and visual entrainment together, two things are kind of going down. A, we're adding an extra element of stimulation, so we're really impounding that brain from all directions. If you add CES to it, which we often do, and put ear clips on the earlobes, now you're adding electrostim to it as well, and you're really hitting it even harder. And that has been shown to augment the effects. But in addition to doing all of that, when you add auditory, because a lot of people with entrainment with brain problems are also typically anxious, and they can't settle down. Their brain is always racing. They can't settle down, and they're just on edge. And so they're always in a state of flight or fight, basically. And that's a bad place to be. Cortisol causes all kinds of damage to the hippocampus, so it impairs learning and memory. It exhausts your adrenals. It exhausts all kinds of things in the brain. And so I find that the auditory also, not only does it stimulate the brain, but it also helps you dissociate because it blocks background noise to a fair degree. It overwhelms us. It overwhelms our senses. And as a result, people drift out much more profoundly and deeply and quickly when they get both presented. Now, if I'm in a noisy environment, if I'm on a plane or a train or something when I'm traveling, and I'm especially for jet lag, and I need to adjust the time zones, and seeing if I'm in a hotel room, I'll just run the standard beats. But if I'm in a noisier environment, I'll run the binaural beats, because binaural beats, being two continuous tones, they help to block out the background noise even more effectively again. And then basically the lights are doing the bulk of the work. But again, whenever you have all kinds of little interruptions in your brain, it bites into that thalamocortical loop, and it impedes the entrainment process. So whether you use binaural beats or white noise or anything, it helps to block out the back, or even earplugs. You just got to block out a fair bit of background noise so the brain can get into the entrainment part of it without being interrupted all the time with external stimuli that's coming in through the ears.
Wow. And you talked about Cranio-Electro Stimulation, and not many people have sort of paired it with the audio and the visual entrainment. Can you briefly touch about, the benefits of CES, how it works, and, why it's so effective with AVE?
Yes. Well, again, I'll mention on our website, I've got a full article published on CES that really makes it apparent as to how CES works. But basically, when you put ear clips on each earlobe, it appears to be a couple things are going on. One is there is a mild entrainment effect that spins from using CES, if we're using it in the brainwave range. But the other thing is that the electrical waves are passing through, and the currents are passing through the brainstem. Well, the brainstem is an important generator of endorphins, serotonin, acetylcholine. Dopamine is generated there too, and that's an important neurotransmitter for brain function. So it's been shown that, with CES, you really hit these areas. And other studies have shown that primarily serotonin and endorphins, they increased often by 150 to 200% in a 20-minute span using CES. So CES is primarily used for things that where we're too wired up. So depression, anxiety, insomnia, and pain. And pain clinics have used the combination of AVE and CES remarkably well. And it works. And same thing with war vets who have injuries and things like this. So if there's a pain element to it, it works particularly well. The entrainment gets them to that very, very deep meditative trance, while it's also, I would say, recovering neuronal brain circuits. But the CES is really upping the serotonin and endorphins and taking that pain away. So a person can feel just relaxed and peaceful for a few hours a day instead of always on edge. That edginess is really destructive to brain function. And anything a person can do to just get into that comfort zone is rejuvenating for the brain.
Wow. And with CES and AVE, is there any future? Where do you see the future of sort of brainwave entrainment heading in the next few years and in the upcoming decade? Is there any other technologies that you see in this area?
Well, certainly transcranial DC stimulation is fascinating. I use it on myself personally. I use it on my clients a lot, particularly if they show a localized problem. And we see it on an EEG, and maybe they got damage to an auditory cortex, or maybe they got damage to the somatosensory cortex, or maybe a frontal lobe, or who knows what. But on an EEG, if you see a slow wave and typically there's a phase problem there too, and it's one isolated spot, you can transcranial DC stim works remarkably well. There are 800 studies done to date on transcranial DC stim. Stroke, it's used remarkably well in stroke. Aphasias, speech impairments, language impairments, motor impairments, it works remarkably well. for recovering stroke, where the neurons themselves are damaged. And that's different than a diffuse axonal injury. In stroke, usually the neurons get damaged, and the networks between the neurons and the thalamus are still intact. Although sometimes they can be taken out too. But often they're intact, but just the neurons are toasted. And so you have to work the neurons, what they call the perilesional area, or the neurons in the surrounding area where the stroke was. And you can recruit those neurons to get on board to take over the task that got damaged. So TDCS would not be used in the concussive type of scenarios I've been presenting earlier. And entrainment, you wouldn't really use for these isolated regions usually affected by stroke or other things too, including head injuries can affect them as well. But TDCS is remarkably powerful. Again, I have a big article on my website about it. Other things that are coming out, transcranial magnetic stim is showing promise. And we'll be seeing more work on that. Nick Dogris has a machine. It's what's it called now? The something field. And he's been doing some pretty interesting work recovering people using transcranial magnetic stim of his own variety. We'll see more of that. I think the biggest thing is we need to break this. Right now, there's this. The public at large have been, I would say, kind of brainwashed or coerced into believing that the medical model is the only good model and a pill is the only real way to treat it. And we need to shake up that model of belief because it's completely invalid. And as we see in the news, more and more news is we're increasingly getting bombarded with news about different types of techniques. Particularly electrostimulation seems to be popular, and non-drug approaches to brain stimulation. But getting the message out there, stuff that you're doing, where you're having these podcasts and things, is critical. So getting the word out is one of the most important things, in getting people to do a paradigm shift on how they see their approach to health and wellness, and mental wellness in particular, is critical. And getting these things tied into smartphones and things like that is also going to be an important step forward. So it's just so easy to use, and we're working on those steps at the moment. But part of the problem too is that there's all kinds of companies spinning product out of their basement, and they don't know how entrainment works. They don't make machines that properly deliver it. Yep. And they cause negative side effects that sometimes cause a lot of problems. And as long as they keep doing that, entrainment keeps getting pulled back into the perception of a new age scam. Yep. And we have to put an end to that. So we need some kind of I don't want the government getting involved, but some kind of a body that maybe reviews products, devices, and puts a stamp on those that are following the proper procedures and the physiology involved in entrainment when it's done correctly, and those which don't. Like, for instance, binaural beats is a good example of a technology that's been completely misbranded. All the science shows that it is not entrainment, but it's always branded as entrainment. And so many people I know use binaural beats and say, well, it didn't really work for me. And I go, yeah, I know. Right. It's not going to. And that needs to be stopped because it keeps pulling us back it keeps losing, the technologies lose their credibility all the time and get pulled back into nonsensical treatments. And so people discount it and don't use it. When in reality, it's good hardcore science. It's just a matter of doing the science and presenting it.
Yeah. And there's a lot of people that listen to this that are self-experimenters, and they like to proactively learn more about neurology and entrainment and things like that. And for those types of people, are there any types of books that you'd recommend if they wanted to learn more about brain waves or brain stimulation or entrainment? Or is there any books that you continually recommend to people that ask?
Yeah, well, some of it is, a lot of the stuff I read is pretty high level. I think, and it would probably be overwhelming to start. Yep. Certainly on our website, on the mindalive.com website, there's the research tab. And click on the research tab, and the top listing says research articles by Dave Siever. Mm-hmm. And these are all articles that I've published. There's about 15 or 20 in there. on entrainment, Cranio-Electro Stim, transcranial DC Stim. Most of them have been published in journals and books or magazines like Biofeedback or Neuroconnection, so they're professionally written. And they're kind of written for the lay person, so they're kind of easy, but also they have enough technical information that they're really appreciated by clinicians as well. And that's a good place to start. Other books like Doing Neurofeedback by John Dumas. Mike and Linda Thompson have got a new book out on biofeedback and neurofeedback. I forget the title of it, but if you Google Mike Thompson, Thompson, or Linda Thompson, Lynda Thompson, they have a special needs center called the ADD Center in Ontario, near Toronto. And I mean, these guys are world authorities, and they published a big 800-page book on brain and function. And I contributed a chapter to their book. It's a big book, and it lays it all out very nicely.
Wow. And are there any, there's a lot of EEG sort of consumer level devices out there, like the Muse and the Emotive and things like that. Are there any ones that, if people want to sort of get into this and tinker around on this further on their own time, is there any of those devices that you'd recommend, or any other sort of self-tracking devices that you'd recommend?
Yes, actually, we've been having big discussions on some of the listservs with the neurofeedback community, because some of those devices absolutely do not work at all. They're complete fraudulent devices.
Wow.
And I would say the only device I'd recommend on a consumer level that is that actually works, and I know it works, is the NeuroSky products. They have a Mind Play. I think their newest one is called a Mind Flex.
Yep.
I have the Mind Play, and I tell you, their stuff works, and it works well. You can get apps on certainly on iPhones, iPads, for both focus and for meditation, and it works very well. Other products that I've tested, I would never touch. That's the only one in a consumer level that I'd recommend for a neurofeedback type of device.
Wow. Okay. Well,
I don't want to get into bashing other people, but the other products are disappointing.
Okay.
Now, on a biofeedback side, too, which is important, there's some good breathing stuff out there, good biofeedback stuff out there. Certainly, HeartMath has some good software. The Wild Divine people have got some excellent software. Somatic Vision has excellent software and for biofeedback and breath work. And so those guys I'd recommend for sure.
Okay, great. And for those that want to learn more about you and Mind Alive and maybe follow you on social, how can they find you online?
We do have a Yahoo groups. It's called, I think it's StimTech at yahoogroups.com. But online, certainly one way to go is to just to go on to like info@mindalive.com or education@mindalive.com and just ask to get put on our newsletter and connected with the forum, the Yahoo Groups forum. That would be fine. Or just go on the website and you can do it through the website as well under training. We also, because we've done so much research in this area, about 3 or 4 years ago, Saybrook University, which are all these neurophysiological guys, they approached me 3 or 4 years ago and asked me to write a course for their grad students. And so that shows how much research we've done on these things, especially the audio-visual entrainment. It is now it's a 24-credit course for clinicians who want to take it. And I really get into the physiology and such pretty deep. And even lay public can take it as well. They just can't use it in a therapeutic way. They can use it for self-interest. They can take the course. But being with Saybrook University, which is a pretty hardcore course on neuropsychology, or it's a pretty hardcore university on neuropsychology, for me that was a real compliment, and it really was a good testament to the kind of research we've been doing in these technologies over the last few decades.
Wow. Well, Dave, thanks so much for sitting down with me. I feel we could have talked for 8 hours just on the amount of knowledge that you have on these topics, but unfortunately we only had the hour. But thanks so much for sitting down with me. All right, that was Dave Siever of Mind Alive, and I want to give him a special thanks for sitting down with me in today's episode. And if you enjoyed this episode, go check out mindalive.com. Check out their products. There they have all the information and all the different research studies and the case studies that we talked about in this episode. Or you can go to our blog post on this episode, and there we're going to have all the links and resources that we mentioned in this episode for you guys to just reference. And if you enjoyed this episode and if you enjoy Warrior Radio, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and give us a rating, because it helps grow the podcast and it helps give us feedback to make it a better experience for you guys. So with all that said, I want to say thank you for sitting down with me today, and I will see you on the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.